The era of the good, Paul and politics in Romans 13, the topic of my paper. First, New Testament and politics, general reflections. The general topic with which we are concerned during these days is the Bible and political thought. The designation Bible includes two different sets of texts. On the one hand, there is Israel's Bible, and on the other hand, the Two Testament Bible of the Christian churches. What types of political thought do we find in the second section of the Christian Bible, referred to as the New Testament? When interacting with this collection of texts, we find ourselves in a clearly defined geographical realm and a distinct historical and political context, namely the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. The writings of the early Christians, as everybody knows, were produced between about 50 and 130 CE and encompass about 3 generations. The experiences with the political world took place primarily in the eastern region of the Roman Empire, but even before Paul, early Christianity had already arrived in Rome, the city where our conference takes place. A partly different context can be found in Palestine and the political realities and relationships between Roman rule and the Jesus tradition. In some, the New Testament texts reflect a variety of cultural and political encounters of the first Christians with the empire and draft considerations of how to deal with the political and legal authorities. What could political thought mean for the small Christian communities that were unable to influence that which had been called politics since the time of Plato and Aristotle, namely the formulation and realization of a manner of life within a society that set forth laws for itself on the local, provincial, and even imperial level? These communities had neither political ambitions nor political voice. Nevertheless, from the beginning, they organized themselves as groups, ecclesia, similar to Greco-Roman associations, and by that could be perceived ad hoc by the Roman authorities as local religious troublemakers. This perspective can already be seen in the prefect Pontius Pilate's view of Jesus, and is officially communicated by Rome at the latest by the time of Pliny the Younger. That those who confessed Christ attracted public attention can also be seen in the fact that already the first generation of Christians in Antioch were labeled Christiani, likely by the Roman authorities. The Latin identification Christiani is especially indicative of the rather political understanding of the group in the view of the Romans. The first Christians, however, did not understand themselves in this way and did not name themselves in this way. They were far more likely to identify themselves with only religious terminology, such as holy ones, elect, and in particular brothers and sisters. The early Christian communities had an inward focus and were interested in the growth of their own congregations, even though they also sought to live in peace with those outside, as Paul says. Ecclesia were established in the large cities and did not go unnoticed. Congregational life took place in various contexts involving certain tensions that were visible to those outside and could possibly lead to public consequences and conflicts. The fundamental first tension took place between two poles. The one pole was the origin of the Christians in the ethnos Judaion, which bound them both within and outside of Palestine, though often in an unclear manner, to the legal standing, life, supervision, and authority of the Jewish synagogue. The other pole was their belonging to the ecclesiae, TU or Jesu Christu, from Judea to Rome as a new religious and social organization or institution of their own. Non-Jews were also taken up into these communities, which led to difficult questions of religious belonging and ethnic identity that could hardly be resolved. Paul in particular prompted these questions, and they were especially significant in the Pauline congregations. The members of Jewish synagogues were part of the ethnos Judaion, even if they lived in the so-called diaspora and were recognized as such by the Roman Empire, whatever the empire would do with them. By way of contrast, the followers of Christ who did not have Jewish roots, also did not have any clear legal status. Furthermore, the status of followers of Christ who had Jewish roots, as Paul, but joined the ecclesia was similarly unclear. The extent to which such individuals still belonged to the ethnos Judaeon was debated both within and outside of the congregations and the synagogue, and was the source of considerable conflict. The Roman authorities viewed these tensions, if after all, as yet a further instance of local unrest in the city's stasis, unrest that they sought to suppress. Paul the Jew was himself repeatedly viewed as a troublemaker by local Jewish institutions and accused before city authorities and Roman administrators. Ultimately, the accusation of certain Jerusalem Jews led to Paul being arrested and later being executed in Rome, as far as we know. A general and widespread persecution of Christians by the Roman political authority did not occur during the first 3 generations of Christians, though there were individual executions as attested in the Revelation of John. It was, as already said, under the governor Pliny that the Christian communities became a political topic for the Roman state. The growing number of Christiani was perceived as threatening for the local residents. Though there was no official persecution of Christians in Bithynia either, there apparently were numerous legal cases that resulted in the death penalty if the Christians did not recant their confession of Christ. Pliny and Trajan agreed that the pertinacia et obstinatio of the Christiani deserved the death penalty. Just as there was no tension-free coexistence of synagogues and Christian ecclesiae, there was no peaceful life of a simple and undisturbed existence as a citizen within the polis for Christiani. Those who confessed Christ found themselves in perpetual danger of being accused or attacked. A further tension is less overt, though it is of greater significance for the question concerning the political thinking of early Christians. It is the tension between, on the one hand, the extremely small number of Christianoi, the insignificant position of their leaders, and the generally relatively low social status accompanied by minimal public influence of its members, and on the other hand, the ethical claims and philosophical religious assertions by the New Testament authors. Over and against Jews as well as against non-Jews, the Christian leaders claimed to be proclaiming the only true religious ethical message. At the same time, in a very brief span of time, they created their own religious and ethical literature with their own recorded history, which, as I think, is most important in known history. The Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. Their interpretation of the past, the present, and the near future did not remain on the level of a theoretical description of their worldview, which would not threaten the Romans, but had eminently practical ramifications and consequences. Ecclesiae were established, a new type of cosmopolitan citizen was proclaimed. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave or free man, there is not male or female. Members of the congregation were addressed as holy and elect. The message was connected to an ethos of perfection, including the willingness to suffer or even die, and was preparatory for the end of the world and God's final judgment. Jesus Christ was proclaimed as the heavenly Kyrios, who had all exousia in heaven and on earth, Matthew 28, who would destroy every arche and every exousia and every dynamis, political terminology, 1 Corinthians 15, and would reign basilein, 1 Corinthians 15, until the eschatological rule of God. Even Paul, therefore, already predicts a cosmological end-time power. This power struggle. This struggle and tension is manifested in a variety of ways in the early Christian communities, including an opposition between insiders and outsiders, or between the cosmos and the holy ones. The book of Revelation interprets this tension entirely along apocalyptic lines, and different from Paul, relocates the struggle between the Roman Empire and the heavenly powers to the eschaton, while Paul only thinks of a struggle between cosmological powers and Christ. In contrast, from the very beginning, in sum, for the Roman authorities as well as for the synagogue, the ecclesia of those following and confessing Jesus as Christ was an association that time and again became the focus of state suspicion or public suspicion. In contrast, from the very beginning, the leaders of these congregations themselves formulated not only the high standard of an ethos of perfection, but also the obligation for their congregations to live in peace with all people. A third tension arises out of the language employed by Christians: Kyrios, Basileus, Basilea, Soter, Evangelion, Ecclesia, Apostolos, Ethne, and so on. Several of these key and central terms utilized by the authors of the New Testament texts had their own religious connotation in the Septuagint, even as they were also part of the lexicon of general Greek political terms. Israel's Bible had already applied the vocabulary of rule and authority, and we have heard a lot of that, including terms such as Kyrios, Basileus, Basilea, Soter, to the God of Israel. This fact offered Christian thought the possibility of criticizing, at least in part, the political realities of their day on the basis of divine limitations, we heard about that, set upon them, even as the Christians did not fundamentally question the legitimacy of political authorities. It is precisely at this point that my text, Romans 13, is to be located in regard to its theoretical aspiration. The terms Evangelion, Ecclesia, and Apostolos attest the implicit institutional claims set forth by the early Christian communities. The same is true for the general claim on the part of Paul to be leading the ethne, this is everybody, to Christ. This abiding ambivalence of the early Christian theological language is quite evident in a sentence Paul penned in his letter to the Philippians. But our commonwealth's politeuma is in heaven, and from there we are expecting the Savior, Soter, Kyrios, Jesus Christ. Politeuma is a classic Greek notion of the state, but is also used metaphorically, and Paul here utilizes it as a religious term of contrast or conflict with his advisories in Philippians. With a view towards that which has been observed, it becomes clear that numerous closely related and interrelated tensions and problems in Christianity's formative era could lead to political thought, and indeed had to do so. First, there the role of Jesus of Nazareth as a Jewish eschatological prophet who was brought to death on the cross under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Second, Jewish apocalypticism with its Basileia theology and religiously connotated language of rule and authority that could also be understood as including political claims. Third, the understanding of the risen Christ, the risen Jesus as Christ Messiah and the heavenly Kyrios. Fourth, both religious and political consideration is the very concrete issue concerning taxes, which was especially virulent in Judea and led to the first Jewish war. It also played a role in Rome, at the latest by the time of Claudius and Nero. The explosiveness of this topic within the context of the Jesus tradition is evident in Mark 12, and Romans 13 presses the question into fundamental issues. In all these topics and concerns, the foundational questions deal with, on the one hand, the justification of authority, and on the other hand, the preservation of peace, whether through conformity with the political and social environment or through persecution and suffering. Most important is the absence of the thought of political resistance. Nevertheless, and I know that this thesis is not undisputed, Nevertheless, ultimately, and right from the outset, the claims of the Ecclesia had an inherent political dimension. Now I come to Romans 13, second, in the context of Paul's life and experiences, because the early Christians lived in a complicated situation, and we have to think about their experiences. Above, I refer to the tension between the claims of the earliest Christian authors and the social reality confronting the congregations. The exalted claims and the high sense of worth on the part of early Christian leaders is perhaps best attested in Paul's epistle to the Romans. The letter to the Romans presents an older man who understands himself as an ambassador and introduces himself as having a personal commission from God and the curious Jesus Christ. He understands his mission to be the preaching of the gospel, the public proclamation of God's saving message for all people. The area for which Paul is responsible is the whole Roman Empire and its entire expanse. His mission is to the people of the Roman Empire that are not Jews, thus the vast majority of the population also in Rome. As a matter of course, Paul travels from province to province, from city to city, from the east to the farthest reaches of the west, and regularly returns to Rome. The imperial standard and its universal line of thought has to be upheld when traveling in the Roman Empire. Paul's journeys brought him into regular contact with representatives of the state and municipal administrative structures and institutions, the exousiae, or potestates, of the cities, that means the city magistrates, as well as proconsuls, encountered Paul in their judicial capacity. Because of disagreements and conflicts with members of the synagogue or local trade associations, Paul time and again clashed with municipal officers responsible for public order and safety. His Roman citizenship did not protect him from being beaten with rods by Roman authorities. The extent to which he had contact or interaction with tax or financial authorities remains unknown, though I personally think this was a big issue for Paul. Acts emphasizes in particular Paul's interaction with governors and client kings with whom he interacts at eye level and opens up the narratival perspective to Paul's appeal to Caesar. In any case, Paul had a vivid and realistic image of the different exousiae or potestates with which Christians had to deal both within and outside of Rome. Third point, Romans 13, what the text says. Romans 13, 1-7 is a thematically independent text with clear contours within the paraenesis of chapters 12 to 15. These paraenetic chapters are written explicitly from the thoroughly eschatological perspective of Paul, that means from the perspective of the kairos, the end time. And Romans 13, 11-14, the following text, is a contemporary temporal statement with ethical consequences as Paul communicates to the Romans the present time in the eschatological sense. Nun, our salvation is nearer to us than when we believe the day is at hand. Within this context of an end times distance from the world, Paul does not promulgate the motto, it no longer depends upon our behavior and action. Let us do what we want, we will be dead. Quite the contrary. He appeals to his fundamental ethical theme, the good, to agathon, and this was already addressed this morning. It is the time, the era in which confessors of Christ should do the good, which is explicated by Paul in that which ensures in the following chapters. Overall, he molds the structure, the behavioral norms and forms of the ecclesia tuteu, or the insiders. In this way, something like his own conception of a good community, a politically good community, an ideal, at the eschaton takes shape. The fundamental approach and claim of Christian congregational ethics at the end of time that Paul presents here is evidently understood by him as counterpoint to the general ethics of the Greco-Roman political social world of his time. The latter challenged him to venture into a realm that was actually outside of his competence and to contemplate issues related to it. He felt he had to think about the nature of exousiae. It is within this context that Romans 13 is to be understood. When considering the text, the first verse immediately grabs the reader's attention. Instead of a familiar congregational address like 12:1, I urge you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, there is now a generalized, antithetically sharp formulated emphasis. Let every person be subject to the superordinated authorities. Hypotasso, hypoexousiae. Instead of restricting himself to the ethical rule for members of the congregation formulated by him in 1217, take a thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Here, Paul inserts a thematic teaching concerning the interaction with state authorities. This passage has repeatedly been considered to be somewhat foreign in the flow of the text, but nevertheless, it was conceptualized by Paul as part of his Roman paraenesis. At the same time, this instruction concerns all people, not just members of the Roman congregation. We are not sure what precisely it was that led Paul to insert this teaching concerning one's behavior towards authorities into his ecclesiae paraenesis. The supposition is likely correct, however, that it was the fact of the congregation's political surroundings in Rome, and much has been written about that. In any case, it is important to note that for Paul it was necessary to express himself concerning the Roman political community as part of his paraenesis. Here, therefore, one finds this situation, which gave rise to the political thought in Romans, and it is one of the first steps of political thinking of Christians. It is only in this epistle that Paul expresses himself concerning civil authorities. That which he writes is brief, argumentative, sententious, carefully formulated, rounded off, and from the outset makes a prescriptive claim due to the paraenetic context. You should. For this reason, a rule of conduct of political ethics is found at the beginning of the passage, submit to political authorities. And this means the emperor, the client kings, and the provincial governors in particular. The substantiating justification follows immediately because the authorities have been appointed by God. And that means there is no sort of, so to speak, secular political realm that, for its part, could be evil or have its own independent existence and rules. Though Paul is moving within the context of Jewish and Greco-Roman ideologies of authority, which is often stressed, he closely relates his conception of the legitimacy of authority to his ethical theme of the good. In this, one finds Paul's own theoretical contribution to the topic of political and legal exousia. Do what is good, and you will have praise from the exousia. It is God's civil servant, teuga diakonos, and that means civil servant, for your good, zoi estor agaton. And this is a semantic surprise attack. The political reality, with its own ethical logic, is shown to be not in contrast, but part of Paul's theological ethics for the Christian community. The intersection of these two realms is found in Paul's labeling of the function of both the congregational leaders and the public authorities. Both are tou diakonoi, not only the Christians. In this way, those holding a position or office in the congregation are functionally equal to the public authorities, and conversely, this is also true for the authorities. These authorities are thus domesticated and limited, and in a sense have a function not different that the one congregational leaders have. For this reason, reference is made only to the publicly operative function of the authorities, thus as judging taxes and distributing public honors, not to their position of power. It is in this restriction of the view of the authorities to their functions that one finds that which is, if one is inclined to use the term, revolutionary in Romans 13, and revolution is often used in New Testament scholarly literature. This becomes particularly evident in comparison with Mark 10, the Jesus tradition, or Mark himself, surmises a fundamental difference between forms of public power and violence on the one hand, those who have the power react with power, and congregational leadership on the other, but you should behave in a different way. You should be diakonoi. There is no idea in Mark that political authorities could be diakonoi. Paul creates a synthesis between both on the basis of public service. The perspective Paul has here is superior because the princeps is superior to that we find in Mark. the princeps and his magistrates become a part of the ethics of the good that the Christian is to live out. In this way, the first steps in Christian political thought are taken here in the letter to the Romans. The relationship between Christians and the Roman Empire is not set forth as one of fear, of conflict, of subordination, of substantial difference. Instead, the empire is integrated into the ethical mission of the Christians to create the era of the agathon. Here, the exousiae fulfill their tasks of judging, collecting taxes, honoring citizens, whereas the congregations exercise agape, which Paul extrapolates upon in Romans 13, 8-10. Much has been said about the Wirkungsgeschichte, and I point to the wonderful commentary of Ulrich Wilkins in his commentary on the letter to the Romans, where you have a small monograph on the whole Wirkungsgeschichte of Romans 13. I cannot add anything to that. So I come to concluding reflections. Paul and politics according to Romans 13. Romans 13 has been the focus of a theological thought on politics since the time of the Church Fathers, as you can read in Wilkins. But during the past few decades, a new debate on how to read Romans 13 has taken place. The possibilities for contemporary application of Romans 13 now range from strictly historical interpretations of Paul's posture to contemporary revolutionary approaches. New Testament scholars continue to disagree quite substantially about both the genuine meaning of Romans 13 and the possible hermeneutical applications of the Pauline text. To name only one very important exegete, Stefan Krauter, in his exegetical study of Romans 13 from 2009, bluntly denies the relevance of Romans 13 for modern democratically based political Christian ethics. Eminent scholars from the previous generations, such as Helmut Köster and Dieter Georgi, and in their way contemporary colleagues from the United States and from the UK, read the letter to the Romans in particular as a political manifesto. Any application of Romans 13 depends to a significant degree upon the historical analysis of the text and the reconstruction of the context, but also on the political systems at issue, whether those are Western democracies or totalitarian systems. Western exegesis has to be cognizant, in my mind, of and reflect upon the fact that perhaps Paul's ideas of Roman governance have a different meaning today, according to the political reality of many contemporary regimes. At any rate, current politically oriented critical application of Romans 13 in the Christian context should not be restricted to the experiences in and the political values of the Western world, whatever they are, nor considered only within the model of democracy. It is also vital and necessary to discuss the issue of the Bible and politics in what Westerners may consider dictatorial or illegitimate regimes, and explore ways of reading and applying Romans 13 under these kinds of conditions in which many of our human friends live. Those scholars who deny the primary importance of Romans 13 for our own contemporary political thought read the text first and foremost as an admonition to mere subordination that is no longer important or relevant in a democratic political system. And I cannot hide the impression that these readings fall short and are at least implicitly guided by a biblicistic hermeneutics that emphasizes especially and only the first verse of Romans 13, be subordinate to. By way of contrast, my own reading takes its point of departure from Paul's refusal to present an agonistic or obsequious perspective on politics. Paul's primary idea of government as a promoter of to agathon, which is very clearly pointed out by himself. This is not a thing I have invented. Also Paul's primary idea of government as promoter of to agathon in the public sphere opens up a fearless understanding of political negotiations from the side of the Christians. His understanding is an overall theological one and therefore is able to go hand in hand with, so to speak, secular endeavors promoting the good, independent of the political system. For Paul, to agathon works as the political key term and may cover both sides, the communities and the state organizations. This thought is far away from what we moderns call political theology. The focus of this interpretation of Romans 13 is upon the welfare of human beings in a world that is under different rules, but after all is and remains under God's rule as long as the nun kairos will last. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your paper.